Good evening. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be in Rochester and to be having conversations around race and racism. Sometimes when we have these kind of conversations, I'm always curious if people are going to show up, because these are the kind of conversations where people sometimes avoid at all costs. And so grateful that you all are here and to have conversations around race and racism. And particularly for us to be thinking about it, I like to think about the church and its own engagement on these subjects and expanding its own understandings and frameworks of what we mean when we even talk about race and racism. And so that's what I hope we can do, spend a little time doing today. So I periodically get a lot of requests to meet with local faith leaders in my own area. Many times pastors want to pick my brain and ask me questions and kind of process things. And so I can't always do all of them, but every now and then I try my best to kind of connect with folks when I'm able to. And so on one particular occasion, this was a few years back, even before I wrote my book, pastor, he was a white, 30-something pastor, kind of a younger, trendy church, and they were kind of growing fast. And he reached out to me and wanted to have a conversation and get to know me better and share stories. So we met. We met halfway. It was a summer and hot day, and we met at a McDonald's in the middle of the afternoon. And so there we were, and we're swapping stories and sharing our experiences, and we're drinking sweet teas from McDonald's, if y'all know the dollar sweet teas. I always joke, so I'm from the north, but I always joke about like loving Southern sweet tea, and you're having like the real stuff when the sugar's gritting through your teeth, right? You got a cavity while you're drinking, and then you've really enjoyed yourself. And so that's what's going on. We both had sweet teas, and we're kind of just sharing stories, and we had a lot of folks that we didn't even realize that we had in common between each other in terms of friends and acquaintances. And so it was just a good time, and also just sharing some of our life experiences, right? Some of them similar, some of them very different than one another. And as we went and as we talked, we just shared and kind of grew in an understanding. And then partway through, my friend there, he grabs one of these sweet tea cups and he puts it between us. And he's like, Drew, he's kind of having like a little serious moment. Drew, you see this cup? You see on one side of the cup, there's a logo, and on the other side of the cup, there's some writings, and you can't see what's on my side of the cup, and I can't see what's on your side of the cup, and so I need your eyes to see on your side of the cup, and you need my eyes to see on my side of the cup, and so we're kind of having like this nice little PBS moment, right? It's kind of nice, And so I was like, oh, that's really kind. He's kind of talking about how we need to share and swap stories, kind of like what we were doing. So after he was done, I said, that was really nice, but life doesn't actually work like that. We all should be sharing stories, but that's not going to solve racism. And to be honest, I already know what's on your side of the cup. That's what I told him. And then I explained what I meant. I said, look, when it comes to race, I grew up, even in all black neighborhoods, I had mostly white teachers. I had to learn about Eurocentric history and art and literature. As I went off to college, I was the only young black male on my floor. I had to navigate all the kind of different cultures and worlds that were going on. Even the work that I do today as a professor and speaker, I couldn't do what I do without understanding and having processed what white people are thinking sometimes as they're staring at me, speaking to them, right? And so I got to make sense of these things. And so I've often had to navigate these white dominant cultural spaces throughout my entire life. I've had to learn these things. And I said, because my friend, he was an InterVarsity Press author, doing well, travels around himself some. And I was like, look, you can never step foot in the black community. You could go your whole life not know anything about black intellectual thought, art, literature, trends, music, culture, any of that stuff, and you're going to be just fine. You can just stay bubbled off in white dominant cultural space, peers, networks, all of that, and that's not going to change or impact your life at all, right? In terms of him being able to do what he does. And so what I wanted to help him see at that point was that race isn't just a cultural exchange program, right? Solving race is more than just a cultural exchange program, because if we just think of it in those terms, we're not being honest and we're not paying attention to the power dynamics that lay behind all these things, so that what what history and art and literature gets taught in school and all those things have huge histories and power dynamics that we've got to unpack and pay attention to if we're going to be honest about trying to solve these problems. And so as good, as well-intended as he was in terms of his idea of, just sharing stories and we needing each other, it's just dishonest that in many ways it's much more complex, and we have to pay attention to how race actually functions in our society, and we have to have a better framework of how that actually impacts our everyday lives. And so that's hopefully some of what we can spend a little bit of time doing today. So I always like to bring really deep thinking philosophers into the conversation, so I figured we'd start with Chris Rock. So Chris Rock, he has this quote. I'll just read it. He says, this is about reframing conversations on race. He says this: so to say Obama is progress is saying that he's the first black person that is qualified to be president. That's not black progress, that's white progress. There's been black people qualified to be president for hundreds of years. The question is, my kids are smart, educated, beautiful, polite children. There have been smart, educated, beautiful, polite black children for hundreds of years. The advantage that my children have is that my children are encountering the nicest white people that America has ever produced. Let's hope America keeps producing nicer white people. His point, though, right, is sometimes we think that progress, especially when we're talking about racial progress, is really about black people improving themselves and people of color broadly improving their lives and stuff. But what we're not paying attention to is that we live in a society that has 400 years of white people controlling and dominating this society, organizing the society, and therefore deeply shaping the lived experiences of people of color in our society as well. And so the difference between what my kids are growing up in and what kids grew up in 1850 only has to do, for the most part, has more to do with how white people are organizing society than it does with their own gifts, talents, and pursuits and dreams. So in the 1940s, there was something called the Clark-Doll experiments. Anybody familiar with the Clark-Doll experiments? A couple people are. Often taught, especially in psychology classes, you'll hear about the Clark-Doll experiments. Pretty popular during the civil rights movement. They kind of looked at that to help kind of argue for the desegregation of schools. What was interesting about the Clark-Doll experiments is that they would take one child at a time, in this case only black and white, but they would sit them down one at a time and have a white doll and a black doll, and they'd ask them a series of questions. Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? Which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And so they asked these questions to kind of process and make sense of the answers that were given. Most people were not surprised by what these white children were saying in the 1940s at that particular time. It's not, we don't remember and pay attention to that particular study because of the white children's answers. We probably can all guess what they said, right? That everything white was good, everything black was bad, right? And so there was this kind of racial hierarchy that they had internalized because of the society that they lived in which they saw whiteness as positive and good and blackness as bad and negative, right? And so we're not shocked by that per se. Why people were more interested in that study was the black children and their responses. Now, oftentimes the framework that people think of is, reverse racism. That's the real problem that we got to respond to. But what they found was something very different than reverse racism. They asked them the same questions. Which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? Which doll is the beautiful doll? And the black children, many of them had internalized the same racial hierarchy, right? So when they asked them which doll is the ugly doll, and they pointed to the black doll. And when they asked them which one is the good doll, they point to the white doll, right? And after all these questions were given, then they'd ask them which doll looks most like you. And after they've given all these negative answers about the black doll, they point to the black doll, right? These dolls look just the same other than the color of their skin, right? And so they had internalized a racial hierarchy in which whiteness was also for them positive and good and everything right in the world, and blackness was also negative. And so one of the things that's important for us to think about when we're talking about race is that we're not just talking neutrally about just racial prejudice in and of itself. There's a particular historical way in which race developed in our country that made particular justifications and arguments that shaped the way that all of us as human beings perceive and see the world, right? It's about seeing and being seen in the world. And so to be human in a society with 400 years of white supremacy shaping its life is going to impact everybody, right? And so we have to pay attention then not only to just the idea of race, but that within the idea of race itself, there's a particular ideology or worldview or framework of racial hierarchy that imagines and helps, it gives us a lens in which we all see whiteness as positive, and there's I guess you could say a laddering, right, of coloration, so that in any community, almost globally, right, you can go and you can see that the lighter you are, the more positive it's seen, and the darker you are, the negative. And you can see that on every single continent in our country, and a persistent